Yeah, it's great to have you on. Really looking forward to getting into some of the deeper, more complex aspects of this topic with you. But before we get into that, we do have some current news to address and some, I guess, governmentally orientated questions to go through because, as many will know, after more than 2 months of delay, the anticipated release of the unclassified ODNI report on UAP has arrived. I think it's fair to say that the vast majority of people are disappointed by the contents. I can't say I'm all that surprised about the lack of details or the lack of precise information. Would love to get your thoughts on it. What kind of message do you feel this sends regarding the overall efforts to investigate this and produce satisfactory reports?
Well, I think it's almost like the phenomenon itself, right? There's a signal to noise ratio, and if you're willing to see the signal and the noise, there's a couple of elements of in the report that really can't be ignored, which that they frankly couldn't lie about the fact that there are events that they can't explain. We've always, for 40 years, been making the statement that yes, the majority of the events that you will see, I mean, the usual number that's thrown out is, let's say, 90 to 95%, or even 99% of the events are going to be explainable and discardable. Well, I think to the credit of the people who put together the report, they probably already threw away the 90% of those that were obvious and weren't even worth discussing. And now they're only down to about 50%, right? So there's 50% or so that can't be explained. So, going from 95% to 50% is, to me at least, a tick up. So I'm always a very positive person. So, of course, they couched it in language that leads you to believe that the remaining 50% or so are not going to be explainable and are likely to be things like sensor glitches or misidentification of one type or another. But they weren't able to do it, right? And the excuse is, oh, well, we didn't have enough data. Well, what does that mean? You don't have enough data to discard the thing that you have already biased yourself to determine is not going to be real. Well, then that's an asymptotic curve that nobody will ever be able to reach the asymptote. So I'm not. I'm actually more excited about the report because it shows that their feet are being held to a fire, and that there are positive outcomes. Chris Mellon put out a very nice written piece about all the positives that he saw in it, including basically them admitting that there are objects that are moving in ways that we don't understand. I think, frankly, more compelling, and that hasn't gotten as much, let's say, attention as it should, is let's say, I think it's 4 or 5 page PowerPoint
from Sean Kirkpatrick. Yeah.
I mean, come on. I mean, look at what's in that. I mean, I'm still a little, on the fence about where AARO is going to be. But, Sean's PowerPoint, first of all, shows several things. He's serious. The AARO office is serious. And for someone who puts together PowerPoints as a living and teaches my students how to put together PowerPoints as a living, somebody put a lot of effort into that, not just from the content itself, the words, but the stylistics that went into it. Basically show somebody who cares about what they're presenting and cares that what is being presented is being done in a respectful manner. So kudos, to the people who put that together, and kudos, I guess. I don't know the man. I've never met him or talked to him. But kudos to him for doing it in a manner that's respectful to the audiences to whom he's going to be presented.
For those that haven't seen it, what are your hot takes from the presentation then that you found were most notable?
Well, I mean, let's bring it up. So pause yourself for a minute. This is very similar, for instance, to for a kind of presentation that a scientist would give in a new area of science that they are trying to outline the necessary steps of how you would approach the problem. So he's asking the right questions at the beginning, and both as an explanation of what it is that the office is doing, as well as how it is they're going to go about resolving the questions. What are the outcomes you expect? How will you resolve? There's a lot of, I think, hidden nuance behind that meaning, but I think, at least to me, resolve in this case means there's going to be multiple classifications or multiple types of observations. How do you classify them into one type of observation versus another? How are these missions, the AARO's mission, how is it applicable to the listening audience? Now, those listening audiences, there's a lot of let's say clients or watchers out there, both governmental as well as military, as well as economic and aviation. So how is what they're doing going to be important to the various audiences that are out there? He defines, at least in the most general and let's say, not making any conclusions about what a UAP is okay, what are the sources of where we're getting this information from? And how are we going to classify them? And now you can see that they've much more broadly defined it as spaceborne, airborne, seaborne, or transmedium observations. Now, I mean, look at that term there, transmedium. I mean, that was a term that Lou and others pushed, this notion that you have vehicles, apparent vehicles, alleged vehicles, that can move from one domain to another, meaning water to air, air to water, air to space, etc. I mean, that's a huge jump. And, I think we can thank Lou and others for pushing this. Because why is that important? Because, for instance, the Navy or the Air Force were basically saying, well, we don't have to tell you about stuff that we've seen undersea because your prior definition of it was airborne or aerial. So now by defining it much more cautiously, we can capture a broader range of objects that people have seen. So that's just page one. That has even gotten going. So, I mean, look at the title as AARO is uniquely capable Defense Department organization that integrates operational intelligence, scientific intelligence, et cetera, to resolve what UAP are. And, our mission, their mission, is, again, this is something that was, I think, a brilliant approach by Chris Mellon, Sean, Jay Stratton, who's now openly basically said what his roles have been, to say, you can worry what this might or might not be from, is it a non-human intelligence, aliens, whatever. You can laugh at it all you want, but the frank fact is it's showing up around our military assets. Not just US military assets, but it's also showing up around nuclear power plants and other things that we might be worried about. Let's just say it's terrorists flying drones. There's plenty of states around the world now, terrorist inclined states of things people would claim are terrorists. There's the Chinese, there's the Russians. We don't want to be surprised. So minimize technical intelligence surprise by knowing what it is. Doesn't mean that you have to say this is either aliens or something else, but you want to know what it is. So let's not ignore it because we're worried somebody might accuse us that we're claiming that it's not from Earth. So, I mean, again, this is a huge, really, thanks to Chris and Lou and all of the others who've been involved. And their vision is to basically develop a normalized approach with intelligence tradecraft standards, highest scientific and intelligence tradecraft standards to understand it. And then understand it from the standard of risks, attribution, is it natural or artificial, et cetera? Are we being observed by foreign? I mean, that's a loaded term. And the disposition, I mean, that's an interesting term there. I mean, that's a bit of a euphemism for what is the agenda. All right, so just those 2 pages alone are really a fantastic jumping off point or anybody, because it's, you know, the push that I have been making over the last couple of years or so is it's not the conclusion so much as it's the data. And the data is, if you can get people to believe that the data has veracity, that it's verifiable, you get to ask the critic, how do you explain it? How do you take this data that you agree with me has been collected correctly? How do you take this data and come to any hypothesis? And if you have a hypothesis, what more information is required to validate the hypothesis? So I think that that's a fantastic thing, because it takes some of these pseudo-skeptics like, you know, Mick West, who basically plays fast and loose with the facts, and basically put them in a box. And it also minimizes the attempts by you know, reporters like Julian Barnes and others who clearly have agendas and don't want to be real journalists, to basically say, look, here's, people are taking it seriously. There's serious money behind this. There's serious people behind this. So what are you going to do about it? So then there's a couple more pages here of, you know, what do they believe is their remit in terms of where they should be looking. They're not responsible for the whole planet, but they're responsible for U.S. territory, operating areas, strategic, what are capabilities and how do these things impact them? And to the extent that we have any involvement overseas, then where might these things also be showing up? And again, are they telling us something about our Earth-based adversaries? I hate to use the term adversary, but I mean, with Russia, that's clearly the case. I would like to think that we have more in common with China than some of my colleagues think. And then just look at the people here. I mean, this is key partners and stakeholders. Oh, this is interesting. I mean, all of the DoD, intelligence community, NASA and the FAA, and surprisingly, the Department of Justice. It'd be interesting to know what their involvement is.
Could be maybe NDAs signed that shouldn't have been signed and things along those lines.
Could be, or yeah, maybe it's people who've been put in difficult positions and not allowed to say, maybe this relates to the language around the whistleblowers. So reporting on their proximity, right? I mean, this is all serious stuff. I mean, this is, who could have imagined 5 years ago that we'd be at a point where there's an office in the Defense Department with an actual scientist. And, you know, I mean, I've looked at Sean Kirkpatrick's resume. In any world that I belong to, he's a scientist, right? With, you know, I mean, yes, he works with the intelligence community, et cetera. That doesn't in any way negate his accomplishments. So I'm excited about that.
I suppose one of the issues for people in like the research community, and this is something I kind of battle with as well, because there is a necessary process of acclimation that needs to take place if you're going to drop this type of information on the world. But at the same time, I think a lot of people see this as us kind of pretending to start from square one and going, oh, right, there's things flying around, we need to figure them out, when actually there's been 70 years or more of vigorous research that has been hidden away. And so I guess for some people, it kind of feels like, yeah, we're getting acknowledgement and we're getting a process, but at the same time, it's kind of a smoke and mirror because there's so much in the background that they've been hiding. I mean, how do you feel about how do you feel about the way it has to come out necessarily, and how that kind of might run counter to the real history of government involvement?
Well, I think the difference is, I mean, yes, all of this kind of stuff has been going on behind the scenes, but it's been going on in a very, let's say, slipshod way, right? There's has been no grand unification approach to doing it. Each of the, let's say, the arms of the military or the intelligence community or any of the scientists who've been involved behind the scenes had their own set of rules. And this is kind of a necessary way to basically define the playing field for everybody. It can be nuanced in different ways. This is the first attempt to say to everybody, look, let's all come to terms with how it is that we're going to be doing this. I mean, let's look at this first box here, synchronizing and sequencing theater, IC, and other capabilities for optimized cross-functional detection, tracking, migration, and recovery. Okay, that's a simple sentence, but behind that is, okay, well, what are all of the sensor systems that everybody has? Does everybody have the same sensor systems? Are there sensor systems that are analogous, not the same, but can be considered collecting the same kind of data? I mean, that to me is the same kind of thing that I would do in a clinical trial, where I am collecting what we call inclusion and exclusion criteria for whether or not an individual for cancer research or a cancer therapy is going to be put on a trial or not. Are they going to be allowed to participate in the trial because they have the right symptomatic background? To make that assessment, I need to have a standard set of instruments or detection tools or tests that I'm personally going to run, or that I'm going to expect somebody in Europe or on the East Coast to run the same standards, so that we can all, we're comparing apples to apples and oranges to oranges. So it seems obvious, but if for the first time it's actually being talked about publicly it's something that, for instance, I can go to now and say, all right, look, if I want to participate in this, even in a public way, maybe I can get from this some leads on how it is that I should be defining my own studies, right? I mean, the next one, revealing and exploiting elusive and enigmatic signatures. This is, if it fits on the curve of something we understand, we can set it aside and we don't need to worry about studying it anymore. So what are these elusive enigmatic signatures? Look at that word, exploiting.
Mm-hmm.
What does that mean? I mean, exploiting can be used
for our benefit.
Yeah, for our benefit. So that means, and I've said this kind of thing before as well, if you observe something that you don't understand and you believe that it is actually a real signature of something that's happening, can we do it too? I use the simple example of people watched and observed birds fly for thousands of years and try to determine if it is possible for humans to do the same thing, going as far back as the myth of Icarus, right? Making the wings of wax that he uses to fly, and then unfortunately plummets to his death. But so through advanced technologies and focused cross-sector partnerships, that's another really key thing. Basically, they're saying not only will we exploit them, but we'll use technologies that we already have and create partnerships for better understanding. I mean, who can deny that better understanding is a better outcome? And this is something that I'm actually particularly happy to see, because I've been pushing this as well. Delivering peer-reviewed conclusions, right? Not press release conclusions, peer-reviewed conclusions. And so this is another, I think, I'll give them this as a get-out-of-jail-free card in the report, the UAP report, that a peer-reviewed conclusion means that in 1 year, looking at 500 signatures, you're not going to come to a conclusion that something is, you're not going to make the spectacular conclusion that something is a UAP, right? I mean, an actual alien vehicle, let's say, until you really know that what you've got is worth claiming, right? Like, for instance, I couldn't make any statements about the Atacama mummy that I studied, even though I knew early on that it was human, until I'd gotten it peer reviewed. So this, I'm thrilled about this, and I think that this is probably one of the most stand-up statements that any good scientific analyst should do, through deliberate synthesis of scientific and intelligence methods, etc. So that's another good thing. And driving shared awareness. And so who couldn't be happy with this? I mean, this is absolutely, I mean, if they hold to these standards, and then educate aviators and crews, right? That's a good thing. A fair number of pilots who end up in commercial, I mean, one of my former roommates from college was a Navy pilot. And he now flies for one of the commercial airlines. So what you're doing is you're educating the aviators in the Navy and the Air Force, a good number of whom will find their way into commercial air. And so they'll be more aware. And that can only help, I think, the safety profile for the country. Encourage reporting. So that's an amazing thing. I mean, look at this. And leverage our systems. And then he goes here into, what kind of information are necessary. Mm-hmm. I mean, this is just fantastic.
Yeah, this is ideal in theory. And hopefully in practice, it will be exactly this. And it's a promising architecture for taking this on. Absolutely. So, did you notice alongside all of the very serious and well formatted wording in that document, have you seen what's written on the logo of AARO in Latin?
I did see that. Yeah. What were I can't remember what the
Well, it's an interesting translation, Gary. The translation from Latin directly is the universe is changing. Our life is what our thoughts make it.
Right. Oh, yeah. Okay. So that's the universe is changing. Universum muteo est. Universe is changing. That's interesting.
Our life is what our thoughts make it.
Yeah. That one reminds me of something that Jacques once said to me that I use a lot is reality is negotiable.
Mm-hmm.
So that might be related to that. So, are they sending a message? Is it a hopeful message? I don't know. I mean, you can go down 1,000 rabbit holes as to whether or not, it's a psyop I've heard. They're just trying to distract us, etc. It doesn't really matter so much if it's a positive message, and it shows somebody's, has a philosophical take on this. That's a good thing. Things I try to teach my students when they're giving job talks, for instance, is, don't just talk about the data. Show that you have a view and a bigger picture understanding of things, because that's what's going to draw people in. It's not what you can see. You're always selling the horizon. And so, to me, that's a good thing. I've seen a number of people commenting on it. And I frankly missed it. So.
Yeah, I think it's a good thing. In my opinion, it kind of subtly speaks to a deeper knowledge and appreciation of the phenomenon and what it might really mean in terms of the underlying implications that are not being addressed from a national security perspective, and lean more into what is consciousness, what is mind, what is matter, what is humanity in perspective to the universe. One thing I suppose it does give me hope is the whistleblower legislation coming into action. And back in, I think it was June of 2022, you said that you were aware of 2 whistleblowers who'd be coming forward to give evidence to Congress. Just wondering if you were referring to Eric Davis as one of these individuals who, as we know, has been very upfront about his evidence to the Oversight Committee. So it wasn't Eric Davis.
No, these were 2 other people. Actually, I now know of 3. And they've come forward now, and they've done the work. And I'm not saying anything that Chris Mellon or others haven't said. At the time when I mentioned it, I got in a little bit of hot water from some of those individuals, mostly because they were, at the time, worried that it might bring more attention onto them directly, because, they were in the process of coming forward, and it wouldn't be too hard for somebody to figure out who might have been speaking to me if they really wanted to.
Right. But these are unknowns. These aren't people that people in the research field would know.
Yeah. I mean, maybe they'll come forward. I don't know. I'm hoping they will. But I mean, the people who know that they were going to come forward now know that they've come forward. And so it's not like they need to hide so much anymore. So it's, and you know, they didn't tell me anything. Is something that
You're not sure of like the specific nature of their testimony or what they were exposed to.
no. And
Okay.
and even if I were, I would fit directly to you.
Of course, yeah, absolutely. I understand totally. I have heard talk. There are congressional staffers who are saying that there is a significant pushback from the U.S. Air Force and the CIA specifically. I don't know if you've heard anything about that and what might be done about it.
I mean, yes, yeah. I mean, the pushback is always going to be there. I don't. I mean that. I don't know what to say about it and why they think it's going to be effective, because you know the jig is up.
Yeah.
I mean, stuff will go back and forth. I mean, I think people are being a little too impatient. You know, we live in the clickbait culture of the internet today. So I guess being a scientist and having started companies which can take 10 years to come to fruition, or one of my companies went public almost 20 years ago. It took 18 years to get the drug that we were developing from some concept, you know, out to FDA approval. I'm sort of used to I'm not happy about the time frames, but I'm used to the time frames that are required in science. So it's, you know, if things are going to apparently speed up, but then slow down. I mean, now what has to happen is that money needs to flush into the system, which will then bring on board the necessary scientists to accomplish the analyses that need to be done. So that's all, to me, understandable. You know, a lot of people, for instance, have been bothered by the fact that I have all these materials to study, most of them from Jacques, but you know, I don't have the time or the money to do it. And people say, well, how hard is it to study? Well, it's not hard if you have the money and the people and the resources and the time to do it. But if you think it's cheap, you're really fooling yourself, because again, it kind of harkens back to what is in here about peer-reviewed papers. Is that a peer-reviewed paper? I mean, somebody just go back and look at that Council Bluffs paper that I published, and look at the amount of effort that went into it just for one material. It's a lot, and people just don't appreciate it. The instruments are expensive. You can rent them, time on them, but again, it has to be done in a way that's reproducible, that somebody else could take it and say, okay, well, he did this, this, and this. I'm going to do this, this, and this, and see if I get the same answer. So anyway, I'm excited, but I understand the pace at which science operates.
Do you feel that it's inevitable that there will be an acknowledgement from the US government of the existence of non-human intelligence and perhaps the existence of crash retrieval and reverse engineering programs?
Well, I mean, I would hope to think so, but I don't know. You know, I mean, there are standards of proof, right? So there's a standard of proof for an experiencer. They don't need anybody to tell them what it is that they experienced or saw. You know, whether what they saw was real or was some sort of manifest illusion in their head, placed there or imagined as a delusion, I can't say. But if you want to talk the language of science, you need a kind of proof that is transferable, right? Whether those numbers are collected and then in a manner that people believe the number that were collected are real, and therefore you can hand it to somebody else to do the same analysis that you did. Or it's a piece of something, biological or material, that you can do a study on and hand to somebody else. That doesn't really exist in the public sphere. There's lots of stuff that people say came from craft. I have stuff that people say came from a craft. The most I can show with one of those materials right now is that there are grossly altered isotope ratios, the U2 of that. But that doesn't prove it came from the Pleiades, right? It just proves that it has isolate. It has all it proves is that somebody did it.
But we can't do it to our knowledge.
Well, at the time that it was collected, no, we can do it. Well, we can make those ratios different. It's expensive, but it begs the question: why would you do it?
Right.
There's no reason to change isotope ratios for a relatively anodyne metal such as magnesium, right? There's no physics reason why you would do something like that. And at the time that it was done, the amount of material that was there, and probably the order of a pound or two, is something that would cost. I mean, I think we estimated at the time a few tens of millions of dollars.
Wow. Okay.
To accomplish, and so you don't just blow that up on a beach in Brazil and then walk away from it. If it was done for some reason, so you have to walk away with a reasonable suspicion that it was an engineering, or it came from some industrial process that somebody thought it was important to do. Now, is it that it's used for something, or is it the byproduct of some other process? Open to question. What it's used for, I mean, for all we know, they use it to scrub their dishes. And this was they just emptied the sink. It doesn't mean that it is the propulsion system.
It'd be such an insult to human intelligence if it turned out to be something so basic, and we were just like, oh, it turns out it's just this.
Turns out it's just what we use to scrub the dishes. I don't know. I mean, but but the simplest conclusion is somebody made it, and we have no reason to understand why they would have made it. That to me that's the signal, right? It's what is the minimal signal you walk away with that you can use to further next questions you might want to ask. All comes around to the utility of things. So, for instance, here's an interesting thing. So I'm part of a project with Avi and others, his new Copernicus satellite project. And the whole question came up in a discussion with several of the board members. These are all prominent scientists, physicists, biologists, et cetera, around, well, what is the utility of just collecting raw data in outer space for these kinds of things? So the department that I got my PhD in, the Department of Genetics, before I got there, was headed by a Nobel Prize winner by the name of Joshua Lederberg. And Joshua was well known in bacterial genetics, and got his Nobel for that. So in that department, the first of the Viking lander experiments were designed for looking for life on Mars. And, there's a whole story behind that, but basically they sent landers, they picked up dust from Mars, they dropped it into a little vat of liquid broth with raw materials for growth, and they had I'm pretty sure it was an isotope release experiment to see whether or not there had been some sort of biological processes that might be going on, and they saw a signal, pretty strong one. Big controversy around it. I won't go into the controversy itself. So I do think they need to redo those experiments and not just look for stuff that might be, 5 billion years old in fossil records on Mars. But when that project was ended in the Department of Genetics, the engineers and a lot of the expertise was kind of sitting around. And my former boss, Len Herzenberg, who invented something called the flow cytometer for immunology, he hired those experts and used that to build out his immunology program. And the flow cytometer is was one of the biggest patents at Stanford. It has changed all of immunology. I followed on his work and developed new instruments, et cetera. The money that came into that actually then created the monoclonal antibody technology for humanized antibodies that also came out of Glenn Herzenberg's lab. One of the second biggest patents at Stanford. And then the money that was basically supporting the Department of Genetics drew in Stanley Cohen, who was then the department chair when I showed up. The Cohen-Boyer patents started the biotechnology industry, Genentech, et cetera. You can trace all of those biological discoveries and advancements that created the biotechnology industry to the Viking lander.
Wow.
Search for life. That shows you how just a small investment can have extraordinarily unexpected outcomes that have benefited life for patients around the world.
That's incredible. And like you said, absolutely is testament to just how, one initial step forward can umbrella out into an incredible series of discoveries. Right.
I think Lou has also made this point at some point. Lou Elizondo has made this point about the investments that went into the lunar lander. And all of the byproduct industries that grew out of it. And he quoted some extraordinary number in terms of the amount of economic benefit to the planet because of that. And that's, there's this whole basic research versus translational and applied research dilemma in science. And it used to be that you only do basic research, and translational and applied research is dirty because you're touching money, and scientists should never touch money except to take money from the public. I don't quite get that, because taking money from the public and they expect something for their investment. It's not just all about you. I think that what we're seeing is a balancing now as well in the UAP field of, okay, well, look, there's extraordinary opportunity here. If any of what we're seeing is real, meaning it's some NHI, and I prefer to use the term NHI rather than alien, because alien has all of these, Hollywood overtones. If it is a real technology, it represents a level of physics understanding that we have no conception yet. We have some math that might approach it, the work of Alcubierre, Eric Davis, Hal Puthoff, and others. But it, to me, that's exciting. I mean, I'm way more interested in getting my hands on some understanding of physics or whatever than I am about, frankly, talking to the aliens. I really am. That's just me. That's always how I've been.
Yeah, well, I'm sure if you talk to the aliens, they might be able to help you out with your understanding of the physics of what exactly they're up to.
Right. I think, but I frankly, if I were them, I'd let us figure it out ourselves. They might give us a few clues, but I mean, it's no fun to be handed everything. I mean, if you ever played any of these, the video games, and you download a hack, and suddenly you can do anything in the game you want and kill, a level 50,000 monster or whatever with a push of a button, the game loses interest pretty quickly.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that. That's actually a model that I've applied to my own existence. I think, well, maybe I'm here because all of the cheat codes have now been removed and I have to just navigate through life as this amnesia-ridden fragment of consciousness that doesn't really know what it is. And, if you were an infinite being of unimaginable proportion, then I guess eventually it would be quite fun to remove all of the cheats and just come down into an individual experience and figure it out.
And challenge yourself.
Yeah.
So I think that any good parent does that as well. You don't do your kids' homework for them, because that's just not going to help them learn anything.
Do you think Do you think that there are programs hidden within the defense and intelligence kind of black budget that are obscuring their efforts from being legitimately disclosed, as is required to the oversight committees, programs that are, off the reservation, so to speak?
I mean, are there programs that are aimed at disinformation? I mean, possibly. I mean, Richard Doty claimed to have been such an individual who was doing that. I would say it's maybe more, if such things do exist, they're more kind of like a side effort of the main program itself. In the early days, Susan Goff wasn't exactly forthcoming. And, if you look at her background and she basically was in counterintelligence.
Yeah, psychological warfare operations.
Psychological warfare. It probably is second nature for someone like that to find a way to verbalize things to accomplish any agenda given role. I mean, she's kind of been on a little bit more, it seems, on the fence lately, and maybe coming to heel a little bit. I don't know. I mean, I'm not going to attribute agendas to the woman. I don't know her well enough, and I'm just going to respect people's best intentions until they prove otherwise.
When I interviewed Oak Shannon, the former special projects manager for Los Alamos, and a name that comes up a few times in the Admiral Wilson documents or the Eric Davis notes, Oak said to me that the conclusion they came to at the labs was that this phenomenon is interdimensional in nature. So what do you think, Garry? Do you agree with Oak Shannon?
Well, I don't have any direct experience as to whether or not they are interdimensional or not, but at the very least, they seem to be able to control the ability to step in and out of apparent reality. So they might not come from elsewhere. They might be from here, but they've learned how to move in ways that could only be described as interdimensional. For instance, let's explore something that's been puzzling me for some time now. So many of the claimed beings that people have interacted with, I'm trying to find whatever the right word is without attributing too much conclusion to them, look humanoid in one way or another. 2 legs, 2 arms, not always the same number of fingers or whatever, but a very similar body plan to us overall. I don't get it. As a geneticist, I don't get it. So it becomes very difficult for me to explain why this is the only form in which intelligence can inhabit, even if it's a fairly varied form. So that tells me one of two things. Either these things are made to look enough like us so that they're, let's say, avatars of some kind, through which something else less, let's say, understandable is interfacing with us. That's one option. I don't know that it's true. I'm just saying it's one option. Or two, they come from some adjacent reality, which is sufficiently, let's say, similar to us that they, at some point in the past, evolution broke off in a different way, and still they kind of look like us, but they are not. And that, in so saying, they're able to more easily jump to us because in whatever the metaverse is, it's closer. I don't know. Or maybe they don't want to go over and talk to the octopoids because they have nothing in common with the octopoids. Or I use the example of we're more likely to be able to breed with a rutabaga than we would with some of the things that we've supposedly seen. That the genetics just don't operate that way. And so, but that's with my understanding of genetics. And so maybe I'm just wrong. I can't be too absolute about what my definitions of the possible are. if I'm going to be willing to, if I'm going to be able to be open-minded about what the possibility is. And so I don't understand that. And so an easy out is maybe interdimensional, but it's also a fake out, just like, waving the wand of quantum, nonsense around every time we want to explain something that has to do with a quantum version of quantum empiricism, or you name it. It's just we're using words we're using words that almost mean nothing as if it means something. So we just have to be very careful about it.
Yeah, that's true. And I appreciate the way that you look at it. And, something that's interested me for quite a while, and I know that this is something that interests you, is the subject of human intuition and creative intelligence, especially as it relates to profound realizations in the scientific realm that kind of act as the precursor upon which an objective scientific discovery is made, which has occurred numerous times throughout history from those most gifted amongst us: Tesla, Einstein, Descartes, Planck, Newton. All of them have managed to tap into this somewhat magical and mysterious flow of information that seemingly arrives from nowhere, but lays the foundation upon which entire revolutions of human ingenuity are arrived upon. So intuition, to me, is evidence of almost like a vital instrument within the human being, one of extreme sensitivity, an instrument that can pick up on, and I'm going to literally do what you just said I shouldn't do, pick up on the fluctuations in the quantum field, so to speak, and it sends these signals into us, and we then interpret that signal with varying degrees of error and accuracy. So I'd love to get your thoughts and ideas in regards to the role of human intuition within science, although often disregarded in its importance by mainstream science, and also how intuition, in your opinion, relates to anomalous phenomena or high strangeness events being experienced, including UFOs.
Mm-hmm. Big area, obviously.
Of course.
So when I was, well before I even got involved in this area, I would go around and give talks at various places, and I've had, usually a lunch with the graduate students or postdocs where they get to, question the expert, ask them questions. And one of the questions that almost inevitably comes up because of my kind of the science that I do is, how are you so creative with coming up with new ideas as to, new instruments to make or new approaches to this? And I would explain it as well in a much more materialist way. At the time, I used to imagine that there were all these little processes running around in my head. I would call them the little elves in my head, that I would kind of formulate the question, and then they would get to work without me knowing anything about what they were doing. And then when they were ready, and at a moment when I wasn't focused on something else, they could scream loud enough, "Here's the answer," and kind of drop it in. And that was my explanation for intuition, which was it's all in my head, it's happening here. And then, and then answers started to come to me that I wasn't even asking the question, or at least I wasn't knowingly asking the question. And probably my most, there's two that have made me most of the, say the money I've made over the years. One is the 293 T cell approaches for making retroviruses. So all gene therapy in the world today using retroviruses is done using a process that I invented with this other guy in David Baltimore's lab at the time when I was a postdoc. And it came from just watching a problem that this other friend of mine was having, recreating an experiment using retroviruses, doing it the old-fashioned way. And I remember just sitting there thinking to myself, well, that just, why should he have to do that? It just doesn't seem right. And then just the idea just popped into my head. And then afterwards, after the group meeting, I went up to him and David Baltimore, the Nobel Prize winner I worked with at the time, and said, "Hey, look, this is what I think we can do." And it changed everything, right? And there was that one. And the other one is something called the split pool approach for labeling cells, which is now a company that I sold once to Roche, and then we spun it out, and we're actually going to get to sell it again. And that's just a way to label cells uniquely, sort of a follow-on for what I did with Len Herzenberg, that I invented the flow cytometer, sort of a next generation. And again, that one particularly, the whole process just fell into my head while I was watching a talk about something else. I had no reason to know it. But it was something I could use. So so I think of it, whatever it is, I think of it as a library system, right? That there's information out there waiting to be organized. It's out there, there are answers waiting to be organized. But if you have enough pointers, like a Google search, if you use the right words, somehow that connects to the information. And then if you have the right mindset or expertise, it allows you to access it and then put it together. But the fact that it comes together as a picture, to me, is what's most remarkable. Like, you get this picture, like, where did that all come from? So again, you can say, oh, it all happened in my head, and the elves were busy working behind the scenes, drawing the pictures, or somehow I manifest it out of this information space because it's a requirement. It's a coming synchronicity, if you will, that the desire to get the information comes from the fact that you're going to need it in the future. And so therefore, somehow you were at the right moment in time, conducive to the signal so you could use it. I'd like to think it's because I'm brilliant, but I'd also, I also have to be, knowledgeable of the fact that it might be that I'm just good at desiring what it is that I want.
Oh, if you're a brilliant receiver, you're still brilliant, Garry.
Still somehow, right? I'm still a dork. I'm manifesting incapable of many things. But I guess it's partly about, I think, intuition can be one thing, being smart can be another, and realizing that you've been handed something valuable and recognizing it for its value is where I think the opportunity always lies. But then also being willing to say, hey, I know I'm right, and I don't care what you say, and I'm going to prove you. I mean, to me, when somebody tells me I'm wrong and I know I'm right, that just gears me up even further. Maybe that's my liver putting me in Scouser, attitude. Don't tell me.
Might be a little sprinkle of that.
Don't tell me what you think. I'll prove it to you. I think there's a lot of people who get information or ideas, but they've been so beaten down by their compadres or colleagues that they never act upon it. And so that I see as, I see that as talent and opportunity wasted. So I think that I try to teach my students, for instance, don't let people, if you know you're right, ignore the critics, just barrel forward. And don't waste your time, but don't hurt yourself, but prove what you're thinking is right, and be confident. I guess that's the most I could say. Now, how this happens, I don't know. Where the information is coming from, I don't know. How does it get transmitted? How does it go from this ephemeral field of information and then become concrete in one's mind? I don't know. But it seems to be related in some ways to, and this is the only way that I relate it, is I've done a few remote viewing experiments with a couple of experts. Ed May is, probably one of the, let's say, unspoken or not often spoken about heroes of the of remote viewing. He took over the program after Hal Puthoff. And I did one with him, a couple with him, which changed my mind about the whole thing. But I noticed when I was getting the signal, as they call it, it had a different kind of flavor, if you will, in terms of like, it was different. The information that happened was different. And so I've noticed that when I have, let's say, a synchronistic event occur, or like I think about somebody and then suddenly they call.
Oh yeah.
Right? When those things happen, if you can train your mind to recognize the manner in which the signal arrived, and I call it the color. I don't think it has a color, but the color or the moment or the surround of that moment. That recognizable moment is the same thing that happens to me when I get certain kinds of science ideas.
Right.
So there's, I don't think it's like some magic, fairy tapping me on the head with his or her wand and saying, here it is. No, it's some sort of neurological event that occurs. And so when those moments happen, I know to spend more time listening to them. Right. I know that, okay, that's a moment. Am I being warned about something? And so, for instance, again, the DOD has a program called the Spidey Sense program. They should call it something else now, but it's not the Spidey Sense program. But basically it's how to teach soldiers in the field to pay attention to their intuition and to train that moment of recognition, because they know that there are people who make good decisions in the field. Like, don't go down that path, go down that path, because that path there's an IED, or you need to worry about this. And whether it's a real signal that they're picking up in the environment or some sort of anomalous signal, it doesn't matter at one level. But learning how to pick up that you're receiving such a signal from your intuition is important. So that's where I think, to the extent that any of this can be trained, it's noticing that moment. Like the other day, I was in my greenhouse. I had a greenhouse, the other day, last year, I was in my greenhouse. And I was standing up on a ladder, and I remember thinking, don't step down or back because something bad is going to happen. And so rather than just ignoring it, I turned and looked, and if I had stepped backwards, I would have fallen over into a pile into something dangerous, right? And so was it because my mind in the corner of my eye had seen something and it had come to, I don't know. But it was one of those flashes of recognition. It was the same flash, and it didn't matter. I saved myself from probably hurting myself badly. So that, I think, but now, okay, we've narrowed a region of the brain down, the whole caudate attainment thing that I've talked about a lot, and then we published on it, right? We published 2 peer-reviewed papers to start to set up the baseline for what should be done, and for further studies if I have the time to get into it. And so, but we've noticed that these brain regions are common amongst families. It's more than the caudate attainment we now know. There's a lot of other areas involved. It's a network. The network structure is genetically determined because we're finding it in families.
And this is in families of people that have had experiences with anomalous phenomena or high strangeness and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, but I don't think that that's. I think that what this is just it's a network that knows when it sees something anomalous, it's going to pay attention to it and not ignore it.
Right.
right? So I don't think that it means that you're an experiencer, but I think it means that you have a mindset, if you will, and the mindset is defined by the brain structure at some level, that is capable of seeing that a point off the curve is not to be ignored.
Right. So it has less of a filter for its perceptual bandwidth, essentially.
Right. It's not like, oh, I'm only going to look at this, and it's basically that you have more choice. So it's genetic. Okay, if it's genetic, then that means that there's a structure in there that's being built that's in the architecture of the DNA. Okay, so what aspect of the genes are allowing for this structure, which is, I use the term antenna. It's a broad term, but it's both antenna, receiver, processor, and then something which overlays onto a consciousness, a conscious decision, which is made to act upon the information. That's genetic. That's fascinating. So what that means is somewhere in that architecture is a process that can collect information that we don't understand. Now, I use the term quantum, but again, that's just a hand-waving term that basically we can access information which is beyond the immediate fingertips.
And is there a correlation between that type of neurological makeup and, let's say, I don't know, higher thresholds of creativity or higher thresholds of intuition or logic, or is there an intelligence difference maker?
Well, I think there's a correlation between these things and what sometimes people think of as others are crazy.
Right.
Schizophrenics, which are along the path of mental health issues. Kind of be careful on getting in trouble because it's the woke era.
I know. Tread with care, Gary.
Exactly. So how many of the people who might be in mental health facilities, not because they have true mental health issues, but because they can't turn off their filter.
Right. And they're seeing and hearing things that you aren't, and it's real to them.
And they just can't turn it off. And then on the other side of the spectrum are the autistics who, give up certain aspects of social interaction for higher function. There seems to be some trade-off there, and they can focus, or they have OCD, or we've all seen the TV shows on some of these individuals. But they still have great abilities and function. They can do math. Some of them can do math at higher levels.
Yeah. But there's always some form of a trade-off.
There's a trade-off, and so so those are the trade-off might be that. I mean, the trade-off for me is a lot of people, when I was growing up, thought I was weird. I was bullied not for being gay, but for being weird. And I just would say stuff that just seemed out of, a classic nerd. But I was a little bit more unusual, I guess, even than that. It's pretty clear it happens early in life. And, there's always a push by society to bring you back to the center. But I would just say that for those who are cognitively dissonant, relish it to a certain degree, or learn how to harness it. I met a fascinating guy the other day at a dinner, by the name of Jay Sanguinetti, who is a professor at the University of Arizona, who's been doing some amazing research on the brain and using transcranial stimulation. And guess where he's focusing? The caudate. Because others have now shown as well that the caudate is important, right? So, we were speculating at the time, but the entire field of neurophysiology are all zeroing in on the basal ganglia as being more than just some evolutionary holdover ancient times. It's a true processing center. So, that's nicely validating to see. And now, in science, the best thing is not just speculation, but being able to go in what's called do perturbation experiments. In science, the best way we think of it is if A leads to B leads to C, we think that that's the path, and you want to prove causality. Inhibit B, stimulate A, inhibit B, and C doesn't happen. You can basically draw a Bayesian inference causality network with that. And so that's what this guy Jay is doing now. He can actually stimulate various parts of the brain, and people can go into induced meditative states.
Wow.
That took, and then apparently he had some work that he was doing with these Tibetan monks, where they flew them all in and they put them under these stimulators, and they said, what kind of meditative state are you achieving with this? And they would say, well, this is extremely similar to what it took us 15 years to learn how to do. So, these states can be mimicked. So imagine when we get even better and better control, we have AI-driven control to basically turn on different areas of the brain. The sky's the limit.
Well, did you see Danny Sheehan's comment recently about telepathic helmets being retrieved and recovered and studied?
I saw that. I saw some mention of that.
Yeah. It's just a throwaway comment that was made on Coast to Coast, but Danny Sheehan, he's a pretty serious character in this game, and so I'd be interested to know where he got that from. But it makes sense. These kind of technologies, and we're getting to a place now with AI and consciousness studies and virtual reality. Oh, you okay?
Yeah, it's not for me, but
no worries. We're getting to this place now where I feel like consciousness is going to really be at the forefront of a lot of technological study, and maybe technology can assist us in expanding our minds in a way that was perhaps once considered the endeavor of the spiritual path and can now be quite easily accessed. If these meditation experts are being flown over and saying, hey, look, this helmet that you've put on me, this has given me an experience that took me 15 years of discipline to achieve. Is that a cheat, a shortcut, or is it just a quicker, more efficient way of arriving at a clearer perspective?
I don't know. It depends on how people use it. I think if it doesn't come along with the kind of, maturity that meditation can achieve, and maybe it's not a good thing. But I don't know. I'm not gonna give it a value yet, but I find it fascinating. Similar to the one where people say you can stimulate a part of the brain, and then that creates the sense of there's somebody in the room with you.
Right.
Or that there is God. Right?
Yeah, the God helmet. I remember the God helmet being a thing.
And people say, well, that's a reason to believe that there is no God, or that there was nobody in the room. Well, no. All that means is that there's a receiving center that accomplishes that goal, and who's to say that the things that were in the room weren't somehow activating that? When people find a material reason for why something can happen, it doesn't mean it's the reason why it does happen.
Exactly.
And so that's where it's always difficult to disentangle people's thoughts, and this is one of the games of the pseudo-skeptic, right? The likes of Nick West, who on one level I respect, but on another I just find him so disingenuous as to be, I guess he's out there. I'd rather somebody who is so bad at it be the person at the forefront of it. It's easier to deal with them than somebody who's actually smart. I like you, Nick, but
in your opinion, are psi abilities like the one studied by the CIA, remote viewing programs, is this type of remote information gathering or non-local consciousness exhibiting ability something that you believe is innate within all of us, or is this an example of a novel attribute that only a small percentage of people are capable of exhibiting?
Well, I think it's the basic ability clearly is with everybody. I mean, there's nobody at a dinner table that you can have a conversation with where you bring up the telephone rings example that doesn't have many examples of that are well beyond just chance. So, but it's whether you can call upon it regularly at will, such as individuals like Joe McMoneagle or Pat Price or others over the years. I mean, that's different. Or as for instance, although it's a different realm, this guy, Tyler Henry, the medium, who I've become acquainted with and met, nice guy. You know, he seems to be able to call upon an ability at will. It seems to cost him in terms of his health and, you know, because you're experiencing other people's traumas through this. So I can't imagine that that's always a good thing. But I mean, that's a unique thing. And there was a brain study done on him at the time. He had very strange brainwave activity when he was doing these things that is completely abnormal. And so, you know, there's not many people who can control their brain waves to accomplish something like that. So, you know, whatever it is that he's doing, or whether it's real or not, it is accompanied by a different state of mind.
Yeah, there's an old saying, mind over matter. You know, we say this to each other when we want someone to overcome an obstacle, mind over matter. It's our way of saying you can do this, that you have to just know that you can do it and you can do it. Do you think that mind could actually be over matter, in the sense that consciousness or awareness of self places you, if not at the top of the energetic hierarchy, then at least a significant set of rungs up the evolutionary ladder, and that if we were to maybe realize this in some way, that we would have control of the energy that forms matter, that we could manipulate it via our intentions? I mean, it's believed that the collapse of the quantum wave is dependent upon the observer's presence. And as an observer, are we also perhaps the engineer, but we just don't realize that?
Well, I mean, I can move this thing around, and that's mind over matter at one level. I'm using matter to move it. Whether we can do it at a distance, I don't know. I mean, I'd imagine someday, maybe. I think so if you were to believe many of the alleged observations of some of these NHIs, you know, that things that happen, you know, as Jacques said, they can take control over a volume of space and they could do whatever they want. Alleged. You know, that's the whole, you know, reality is negotiable concept, that something seems to be able to do that. And so maybe that's in our distant future. I don't know. It's not anytime soon. But I think, but I don't know. I mean, it's a great question, Jay. I don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole, because there'll be like a subreddit somewhere.
Of course, there's always a subreddit. I don't even type my my YouTube channel name into Reddit anymore. It just puts me in a bad mood.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I remember, this is a slight segue, but I remember seeing a clip of an interview that you did. I can't remember what it was for. It might have been for a television series. I don't think it was a podcast. Where you said that human DNA is older than the planet itself. Am I getting that right? Was there some sort of comment along those lines?
No, it's similar to that. So there's two interesting papers that I always like to talk about. And one is, it's called the Moore's Law of Genetic Complexity. It was a paper. It's a think piece. And you know Moore's Law of electronics, that every certain number of years, the complexity of the chips doubles and the speed doubles. So the same idea was applied to genetic complexity, that, you know, gene programs are just software. I mean, from one way of looking at it. And so what they did was they took they took, examples of, let's say, an advanced animal all the way back down to like the most primitive bacteria. And then they basically placed a time at which that amount of genetic complexity would have occurred on Earth, right? And so the Cambrian explosion, for instance, was a point in time where the genetic complexity had turned into Lego blocks of enough different shapes and flavors that you could make all of these extraordinary body forms. And evolution was playing with ideas. And that was the Cambrian explosion. And then, of course, there was the post-Cambrian, collapse. So you could put these on a time frame and show that there was like some certain amount of time for genetic complexity to, evolve the next level of complexity that would enable emergent properties. As you extrapolated the line back, the line didn't hit zero at 4 billion years ago when presumably the Earth life began on the Earth. The line actually went back about 12 billion years ago. The line intersects the x-axis about 12 billion years ago. So what that implied was that life actually began elsewhere long ago. And it has been evolving slowly since then. But, all of the complexity took several billion years to accomplish, but it happened even before Earth was around. People say, well, how did it get here? Blah, blah. Well, everything that you're made of got here because all of our metals and everything came from an exploding star that became a gas and then coalesced into another solar system and became us. 2 or 3 generations of this. I mean, so people just don't deal with those large numbers readily. So that's one. I find that fascinating. Now, it could be the alternative explanation is that complexity happened quickly and then leveled up.
Right.
Right. Just, until we go out there and collect stuff, we won't know. But then that's one of the objectives of the company that Avi and others have started that I'm on one of the advisory boards for, to basically build instruments that we go out into the solar system and see if we can find evidence that even material from Earth can be distributed around our solar system. Can we go out and find a spore from Bacillus out, somewhere beyond the orbit of Jupiter? Not that it means that the spore came from Jupiter, but it just shows that something from Earth can make it that far out. Or can we go and find things on, the moons of Jupiter, Titan, and stuff like that? I don't know. So that's one. And then the other is a paper called the WOW signal in the genetic code, which basically, again, it's a mathematical argument of statistics that says the DNA code is so well ordered that if you wanted to populate the galaxy or the universe with some living form, and you were going to design it, you would likely design it in a very, non-arbitrary way. Everything seems to add up beautifully into something that looks designed. Okay, that's fine. But, the first person who would come after you with a big hammer would be Richard Dawkins, who would basically say, and he's a hero of mine, that you can't attribute complexity as intelligence because evolution can do a lot of organization for you that you don't dare attribute it to a divine intervention. And here we're not saying divine intervention, we're saying that the code was evolved or created by a higher order intelligence. We call it divine if you want. We call it
But what's the evolutionary driver? I mean, I like that to me is an interesting thing. Why does the universe have a preference to order over chaos? Why do things connect over time? Why is complexity a part of its structure moving forward? What's the purpose of it? What's driving it?
Well, I mean, but Richard Dawkins does a great job in his two principal books. One is The Selfish Genie, which basically says, given resources and the ability to replicate, you will replicate. And if you're competing with something, then you will find a way to replicate better. And that's really all you need to explain everything that you see. And then the other one is called the Blind Watchmaker, which is how you can organize complexity out of basic rules, again, using this principle of competition. And so energy and materials, I mean, that was what started the universe. And organization just happens, through, entropy, right? Through the desire for entropy, that you use energy to create structure, but at the end of the day, you're creating more heat.
Well, and that's actually another facet. And like, how long have you got? Because I don't want to take up too much of your time, but how much time have you got left?
I've got about another 10, 15
10,
minutes.
15. All right, no worries. Well, like that's another facet of evolution that interests me. Is that the universe itself seems to be in an entropic state, but it's also in a process of becoming more complex, connecting things together. Humanity being an example of a extremely novel emergence of complexity in nature. So why is the universe running down whilst it's also in a process of almost climbing up and getting more sophisticated?
Well, it's local complexity, but at the expense of additional entropy. So, that's really what's happening. And so there'll come a point in time where there'll be no accessible energy to allow the complexity to do anything. I mean, it'll be trillions of years in the future. But I mean, that's at least what a physicist would tell you. That the suns will all run down. There'll be cold cinders, and everything will dissipate, and the universe actually will start expanding faster, and even atoms will fall apart. I mean, that's one of the premises of what happens with the expansion of space, etc. So, that's kind of depressing to think of.
It is a little bit.
But maybe that's the reason why other NHIs leap universes, right? Maybe they're like, okay, well, ours is done. We're going to go to your universe.
Yeah, potentially.
Hop over, somewhere else where there's more energy. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, it's a fascinating problem, and it's funny. I think you're we may be coming from two different points of influence and inspiration. You're going with Richard Dawkins. My personal idol is Terence McKenna. So a completely completely different avenue of looking at the way in which things might work on an evolutionary scale. One thing I'll ask you actually before we start to wrap up in regards to early human development and the staggering increases in our neurological capability and brain size within a short period of evolutionary time. Have you given much thought towards the stoned ape hypothesis put forward by Terence, which is the idea that essentially the neural avalanching mushroom psilocybin cubensis, commonly known as magic mushrooms, is one of the potential catalysts that led towards our quantum leap from hunter-gatherers to what we've become in the modern world? What do you think about the idea that it was the early and frequent absorption of psychedelic compounds by our ancestors, compounds that we now know can cause neural genesis in the human brain, that acted as at least one of the significant catalysts for our novel increase in cognition?
Well, I mean, to the extent that psychedelics or drugs take you out of your current state of mind, and make you think about things or see connections otherwise. Well, I mean, why not? I mean, the shamans were out there sampling everything they get their hands on, and then learning. And, so I have no problem. I have no problem with that. I mean, most of our knowledge, frankly, of the psychedelics comes from shamanistic practices. End of story. And so I mean, they didn't need to know what it was doing to use it, and so they were the first, frankly, doctors and the first scientists. I mean, the people who made the stone axes and the arrows were the first engineers, but the first scientists were the shamans. And so, yes, they were taking advantage of it. And so let's think about it from a genetics point of view. So you have one tribe that accesses, let's say, an expanded view of the universe, so its local universe, and can see things that others don't. And I don't mean that in a magical sense. I mean, they can see connections that others don't because these compounds or plants enable them to do it. And you're competing with another group that doesn't have it.
Exactly. From an evolutionary perspective, it's a game changer.
It's a game changer. And so who wins? The ones with the genes that do it, that are a little bit more of a risk taker. So, it's and that can speed things up tremendously. I don't like is the right word. I'll say, I don't like this idea that some non-human intelligence interfered with us 70,000 years ago. And that we owe whatever we are today to them per se, genetically, or that they've been interfering with our genetics, because there's, that leaves on the table so much current understanding of how it could happen naturally. That I don't like to use it as a crutch. I don't mind finding the crutch at the end of a long study. I'd like to find the perhaps more natural explanations along the way. And if inevitably that ends up being the answer, then fine. I'm fine with it. But I just don't see a need for it yet. It's very similar to an argument that I had with Kit Green. Not an argument, just an ongoing discussion, is that many of the things that he saw in the patient cohort that we had first collected, that he was the one pushing the idea at the time that this was some sort of, alien NHI intervention, or at least it was very much forward on his. But as he got further and further into it, he was changing his mind to say, look, I do actually know of U.S. government or military programs where some of these capabilities exist to, harm at a distance via energy weapons. So I don't have to invoke aliens to explain it. Now, he wasn't saying that it is. He's just saying I can find a natural explanation for it, so we don't have to use aliens as the answer. And so we don't have to use it again. And I said this before: is you don't need, if you're a non-human intelligence, you don't need to interfere with humans directly, genetically, to change the outcome of evolution. Show yourself in different ways to a given group to influence the decisions that they might make. And that can have a huge outcome in evolution as to who wins the battle. And unfortunately, evolution is always talked about in military terms. But you just need to show yourself.
Yeah.
You just need to have one group win a battle versus those that doesn't, and then all of history changes.
So we'll wrap this up now. You've been very, very gracious with your time. I guess one thing we could maybe just leave it with, given the fact that there has been a little bit of a disappointing ODNI report for some people, what is your message to the research community right now, and what do you think people should be keeping their eyes on for 2023?
So for the researchers, push your let's say, elected representatives or the representatives in the National Science Foundation or whatever the other foundations are for different countries, to be a little bit more open as to how it is you approach the problem. But write the white papers for your funding agencies that they can use as crib notes to create funding structures. There's, a lot of my funding comes from white papers that I write to the NIH or whatever, and then they create a program, and then I have to compete for it. But I at least set the stage. And that's the way a lot of science is done. There's nothing, inappropriate about that. That's just the way that it's done. Somebody has to write these and tell people what they should be studying. And if it's approved, it'll go out for a funding call. So I think that's the first thing is don't sit back and wait for other people to do it for you. If you're going to write a tweet that complains, your next email should be to find a group of people that you can contribute and help. Right? It's not going to happen for you. So that's kind of the big thing that I would say. To my fellow researchers, who are, orbiting this, is just look at the data. Just, I wouldn't be doing this as a serious scientist if I didn't believe that the data was compelling. And if you're ignoring the data, you're probably leaving on the table one of the most extraordinary opportunities for humanity that has been around since day one.
It's been a real pleasure, mate. I think you have a brilliant mind, clearly passionate about a subject, look deeply into the complexities. I think you're the kind of scientist we require, a mind that isn't afraid to look at intuition, isn't afraid to look at anomalies and accept that there are anomalies and they need to be investigated. You're the kind of person we want to see in this position that you're currently in. So thank you for being a representative of the scientific community who's unafraid of facing the mysteries of our world. And thank you for sharing your thoughts with me today. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you so much, Jay. I look forward to it again.